The stampede came out of the West Road just as Samuel Haskins tipped his hat to the wrong woman. He had been standing on the platform boards of the Alder Junction depot since the noon train rolled in, scanning the passengers stepping down through the drifting coal smoke, looking for a woman in a brown traveling coat with copper-red hair pinned beneath a plain bonnet, because that was the description the stage line agent had scrawled on the back of a freight manifest. Company woman, the agent had said. Coming to buy up the water rights on Coulter Creek before the ink dries on any treaty talk. Ruin every rancher and every Cayuse and Umatilla family from here to the Blue Mountains, and smile while she does it. When the woman came down the steps of the second car, red hair catching the autumn light, brown wool coat buttoned to her throat, a leather satchel in one gloved hand, Samuel felt something hot and righteous rise up in his chest, the old grievance of a boy who had watched his own father lose half a homestead to a canal company's lawyer's years before he was old enough to understand what a water right even was. He crossed the platform in 4 long strides, swept his hat from his head and said, loud enough for half the depot to hear, "Well now, if it isn't the company's woman come to steal our river out from under 2 counties of decent folk. Tip of my hat to you, ma'am, and not one bit more than that." The woman turned. She was younger than he expected, with steady gray eyes that did not flinch and a mouth that went thin and hard as a fence rail. "I beg your pardon," she said. "No need to play innocent with me," Samuel said, warming to his own outrage now that it had a target. "I know what your kind comes here to do. My father lost the North Pasture to a company just like yours, and I aim to see it doesn't happen twice in my lifetime." "Sir," the woman said, in a voice gone dangerously quiet, "I have been on a train since before sunrise, I have not eaten since Pendleton, and I have absolutely no notion who you imagine I am, but I promise you I am not her. You're the one with the red hair and the brown coat, aren't you, traveling alone off the noon train?" "I am Mabel Sawyer," she said, each word set down like a stone in a wall. "I am an interpreter, hired by Agent Colton Reeves out of the Umatilla office, to translate at a water council between the settlers of Cedar Crossing and the Cayuse and Umatilla families who have fished Coulter Creek since before either of our grandfathers drew breath. I have never in my life stolen so much as a teaspoon of water from anyone, and if you would kindly step aside, I have a wagon to catch before the light fails." For one long moment Samuel Haskins stood there with his hat still in his hand, feeling the blood climb up the back of his neck, and understood with sickening clarity that he had just insulted a stranger in the ugliest way he knew how, based on nothing but the color of her hair and a rumor passed along a depot platform. "Miss Sawyer, I am sorrier than I can rightly say. I mistook you for someone else entirely. There's another woman due in on the evening train, a Miss Pratt, and I let my own bad history get ahead of my good sense, and I would be obliged if you would let me explain myself properly, because that was a rotten thing to say to a lady who's done nothing but step off a train." Whatever Mabel Sawyer might have answered was lost, because that was the exact moment the horses came through the fence. They were remount stock, 40 head of them, being driven up from the rail pens to the stage company's corral behind the depot, and something out past the water tower had spooked the lead mare, a rattlesnake or a gunshot or nothing at all, the kind of nothing that sometimes seizes a herd and turns it to floodwater in an instant. The drover's shouts came a half-second before the animals themselves, and then the whole platform dissolved into chaos, trunks flying, women screaming, a crate of dry goods bursting open and scattering tin pans across the boards with a sound like church bells falling down a hill. Samuel grabbed for Mabel Sawyer's arm on pure instinct, meaning to pull her clear of the rail, but a gray gelding cut between them so close its shoulder knocked him sideways into a stack of freight, and when he came up spitting dust, she was gone, swallowed into the surging crowd of animals and passengers and porters. He shouted her name, though he had known it for less than a minute, and got no answer but the drumming of hooves and the depot agent's frantic whistle. By the time the herd had thundered past and out along the wagon road, scattering a peddler's cart, and setting every dog in Alder Junction to howling. Samuel Haskins stood alone in the wreckage of the platform with his hat crushed under someone's boot heel, his trunk of mail pouches missing, his own coach horses spooked half out of their traces, and no sign anywhere of the woman he had just insulted so thoroughly that she had every right never to speak to him again. The depot agent, a thin, nervous man named Dunmore, came picking his way through the debris with his spectacles askew. "Lord, Samuel, what a mess. You get your team." "Team's fine, spooked but fine. Dunmore, that woman I was talking to, the one that came in on the noon car, where'd she get to?" Dunmore squinted down the road, where dust still hung in a low gold curtain. "Saw her climb up on the Whitfield family's wagon, the immigrants heading south toward Cedar Crossing Way. Looked like she meant business, too, had her satchel and everything, didn't even stop to see about her trunk. The Whitfields are leaving now, today. Amos Whitfield's been itching to get moving for 2 days, says he wants to be settled before the snow flies. Fool notion this late in the season if you ask me, but nobody did." Samuel looked south, toward the long rising line of the foothills, where the first gray clouds were beginning to gather over the Blue Mountains, clouds that had the flat, heavy look of early snow rather than rain, and felt a cold that had nothing to do with the weather settle into his stomach. He had insulted a woman doing honest, dangerous work that might keep 2 communities from tearing each other apart over water, and now she was riding off into weather that could kill an experienced traveler, let alone a family of green immigrants who thought October in the high desert was still autumn. "Dunmore," he said, already moving toward his coach, "I need you to wire ahead to the Cedar Crossing Way station. Tell them Samuel Haskins is coming through behind the Whitfield wagon and to hold the noon relay team for me instead of sending it out. And find me a spare hat. Mine's been trampled into next week. You're going after them today. Storm's coming in, Samuel." "That," Samuel said, swinging up onto the box of his stagecoach, "is exactly why I'm going." The road south out of Alder Junction climbed steadily out of the wide, dry country along the railroad and into rolling wheat land gone gold and stubbled with harvest. And Samuel pushed his team harder than he liked to on a grade he knew held soft shoulders after rain. Because, for the first time in 11 years of driving that route, he was not thinking about his schedule or his passengers or the mail contract. He was thinking about a woman with steady gray eyes who had told him her name like she was daring him to remember it, and he intended to remember it for a long time to come, provided he could catch up to her long enough to properly apologize. Mabel Sawyer, meanwhile, sat wedged between 2 trunks in the bed of Amos Whitfield's wagon with his youngest daughter Polly asleep against her shoulder, and did her level best not to think about the stranger on the depot platform, an effort that was failing badly. She was angry, that much was simple enough. She had crossed half of Oregon on a series of trains and coaches to do a job that mattered, a job that could mean the difference between a fair water council and a bloody one. And the first man to speak to her at the end of that long journey had looked at her hair and her coat and decided, without asking a single question, that she was some grasping company agent come to rob 2 counties blind. It was the particular kind of anger that came from being seen and not seen at the same time, judged by a stranger's careless glance and found guilty before she had said a word. And yet, there had been something in his face in that last moment, before the horses came through, some genuine and immediate horror at his own words, and she had not imagined the sincerity in the way he had reached for her when the herd broke loose, not to protect himself, but plainly to protect her. She set the thought aside firmly. She had not traveled 200 miles to moon over a stranger's shoulders, however broad they had looked under that ridiculous crushed hat. "You are very quiet, Miss Sawyer," said Corrine Whitfield from the wagon seat, not turning around. She was a soft-spoken woman with a baby not much more than a year old bundled against her chest, and 2 older children besides Polly walking alongside the slow-moving oxen. "Amos says we ought to make Cedar Crossing in 3 days if the weather holds." "And if it does not hold?" Mabel asked. Kareen's shoulders tightened, just slightly. Amos says the trail guide told him snow doesn't come proper to these parts until December. Mabel looked up at the sky, at the flat gray light pressing down from the northwest, at the way the wind had gone still and expectant in the way it did before weather, not after it, and thought privately that whoever had told Amos Whitfield that had either never spent an October in the Blue Mountain foothills or had been paid to say something reassuring. She had grown up at her father's trading post not 40 miles from where they now traveled, had watched more than one Green Party underestimate this country and pay for it, and she felt the old worry settle into her the way it always did, the translator's habit of watching every word for what it truly meant rather than what it was meant to sound like. "We should push for the river ford before dark," she said instead, gently. "If the weather does turn, better to be across Coulter Creek than caught on this side of it." Amos Whitfield, walking at the oxen's heads, called back over his shoulder that he appreciated the advice but knew his own business, and Mabel folded her hands in her lap and said nothing more, because she had learned long ago that the fastest way to lose an argument with a frightened, stubborn man was to keep having it in front of his family. They made poor time regardless, the wagon axle catching on a stone not 2 hours later and losing them the better part of an afternoon. And by the time the sun sank low and orange behind a wall of thickening cloud, they were still a mile short of the ford, with the first fine flakes of snow beginning to sift down out of a sky that had gone the color of an old bruise. It was full dark, and the snow was coming in earnest, fat, wet flakes that vanished the moment they touched the ground, but were beginning, ominously, not to vanish quite so quickly, when Samuel's coach lanterns finally swung into view along the road behind them, and Mabel felt her heart do something complicated and unwelcome at the sight of them. He pulled the team up alongside the Whitfield wagon and was down off the box before the wheels had fully stopped turning, hat in hand, snow already dusting his shoulders. "Miss Sawyer," he said, "I have been chasing you since noon, and I would take it as a great kindness if you'd let me finish a sentence before you decide whether to slap me for it." "I have not decided against slapping you, Mr. Haskins," Mabel said, for Dunmore had shouted his name across the depot chaos and she had not forgotten it. "But I am willing to hear you out, provided you make it quick, because unless I am very much mistaken, that creek ahead of us is about to become considerably less friendly than it looks." Samuel glanced past her, down the darkening slope to where the ford lay hidden in shadow, and understood at once what she meant. Coulter Creek ran gentle most of the year, wide and shallow over a gravel bed, but he had crossed it in early snow before, had seen how fast a warm rain higher in the mountains could turn a quiet stream into something that pulled at wagon wheels like a hand closing around an ankle, and the sound rising up out of the dark now was not the sound of a gentle stream. "Whitfield," Samuel called, "how bad is your team? Can they pull hard if I ask them to?" Amos Whitfield, standing at his oxen's heads with snow collecting on his hat brim, looked between the stranger and the roaring dark of the ford, with the dawning panic of a man realizing too late that his own confidence had outrun his experience. "They're tired, Mr. Haskins. We've come 18 miles today. Then we go slow and careful, and we go now before it rises any further. I'll take the lead in my coach. My team knows this crossing. You follow my exact line. Don't you dare let those oxen wander a foot to either side of my wheel tracks. You understand me." They went down to the water in a careful procession, Samuel's coach lantern swinging yellow light across black rushing water that had, in the space of a single afternoon storm, risen nearly 2 feet above its ordinary gravel bed. Mabel walked alongside the Whitfield wagon with young Polly's hand held tight in hers, the girl having woken frightened and unwilling to ride, and it was this, in the end, that put her exactly where the accident happened. Halfway across, with the water churning cold and gray-white around the wagon's rear wheels, Polly's foot slipped on a stone slick with ice, and in catching the child before she went under, Mabel's own boot found nothing but rushing water where solid ground should have been. And the current, faster and stronger than anything she had judged from the bank, took her legs out from under her entirely. She had one clear, furious thought, that she had crossed 200 miles of railroad and wagon road only to drown in a creek she had swum across as a girl. And then a hand closed around her wrist with a grip like an iron bracket, and she was hauled bodily against a man's chest and half-dragged, half-carried the last 10 feet to the far bank, gasping and soaked through, and shaking with cold and fury in equal measure. Samuel Haskins set her down on dry ground with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the speed of the rescue, and knelt in front of her in the freezing dark, water dripping from his own sleeve where he'd gone in past the elbow to reach her. "Are you hurt, Miss Sawyer? Mabel? Are you hurt anywhere?" "I am cold," she managed, teeth chattering, "and I am alive, which I understand I have you to thank for, and I would be grateful, Mr. Haskins, if you would help me build a fire before you say another single word, because I cannot decide whether to thank you or throw you back in that creek, and I would rather make that decision once I can feel my feet again." He laughed, a short startled bark of a sound, relief plain in it, and set about gathering wood with an efficiency that told her plainly this was not a man unused to hard nights on this road. They made camp that night in a stand of pine above the ford, Amos Whitfield's family safely across and huddled in their own wagon, Samuel's coach horses picketed close, and a fire built up bright and hot in a shallow pit lined with river stone, the snow still falling steadily but not yet deep enough to trouble them, more a soft hissing curtain at the edge of the firelight than a true storm. Mabel sat wrapped in a wool blanket from Samuel's coach, her wet clothes steaming faintly where they hung near the flames, and watched him across the fire with an expression that had gone from fury to something more complicated and considerably harder for either of them to name. "You want your explanation now," Samuel said, "or you want to keep letting me stew in it a while longer because I confess I deserve the stewing. Start talking, Mr. Haskins. I have nowhere else to be until this fire dries my boots." So he told her, plainly and without excuses dressed up as reasons, about his father's ranch north of Pendleton, about a canal company 20 years back that had promised prosperity to every rancher on the creek and delivered ruin to half of them, his father's water right bought out from under him by a lawyer with a smile like a knife, the family moving twice before Samuel was 12, the particular bitterness that had never quite worn smooth. He told her about the rumor on the depot platform, a company woman coming to do to Coulter Creek what had been done to his father's creek, and how he had let that old wound speak before his own good sense had a chance to. "That does not excuse what I said to you," he finished. "I want to be clear, I know that. I looked at a stranger and decided who she was before she'd said a word, and that's a low thing to do to anybody, let alone a woman doing work as careful as yours needs to be. I have been trying to catch up to you since the moment Dunmore told me my mistake, not to make myself feel better, but because you deserve to hear it said properly, and because riding into snow country on a road you don't know, with green immigrants who don't know it either, is not a thing I could let happen without at least trying to see you safe." Mabel was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire, and when she spoke her voice had lost its earlier edge. "My father ran a trading post on the Umatilla for 20 years. I grew up speaking 2 languages before I properly learned to write either one, because the children I played with spoke Sahaptin at home, and I wanted to keep up with them. When I was 12, a surveyor came through claiming government authority to mark out allotments, and he brought his own interpreter, a man paid by the very company that wanted the allotments drawn a certain way. And I watched that interpreter change 3 sentences in a way that gave away half a family's fishing ground on the strength of a lie dressed up as translation. Nobody caught it for 2 years. I decided then that I would learn to do this work honestly, or not at all, and I have spent my whole life since trying to be the kind of interpreter that surveyor was not. So when a stranger looks at me and assumes I am the sort of person I have spent my life trying not to be, Mr. Haskins. It does not merely offend my pride, it cuts rather close to the bone. Then I am sorrier still, Samuel said quietly, and I understand a good deal better now why my foolishness landed as hard as it did. You did pull me out of a creek tonight, Mabel allowed, the ghost of something warmer moving at the corner of her mouth. I am not in the habit of staying angry at a man who's gone in past his elbow to fish me out of freezing water, even if he is the same man who insulted me not 8 hours earlier. I'll take that as conditional forgiveness. You'll take it as forgiveness pending good behavior, Mabel said, which in my experience of men is a considerably higher standard. He grinned at that, the first real grin she had seen from him, and something in her chest, already unsteady from cold and fright and the strange intimacy of firelight in a snowing dark, tipped a little further toward him than she had any intention of admitting aloud. They talked past midnight, about the water council waiting for them at Cedar Crossing, about the company called Birch Creek Canal and Irrigation that had bought up a controlling claim on Coulter Creek, and meant to run a diversion works that would leave the Cedar Crossing ranchers with barely enough to water their stock and the Cayuse and Umatilla families downstream with next to nothing at all come salmon season, in flat violation of the water rights their people had been promised in the Treaty of 1855. Samuel knew Josiah Crane, the company's foreman, by reputation as a hard and impatient man who had already run survey stakes through land he had no clear claim to. Mabel knew Agent Colton Reeves as an honest man overmatched by a dishonest situation, and she knew, better than either of them, how easily an entire council could be undone by one badly chosen word. The last interpreter the company sent up was a man named Foss, she said. He translated, "The company proposes to share the water equally," as a phrase that, in Southampton, carries the sense of the water already belonging to the company to be handed out as a gift. It is a very small difference in words and an enormous difference in meaning, and if Elder Wildhorse had not caught it himself, having some English, there might have been men reaching for rifles inside an hour. And you're meant to stop that from happening again. I am meant to make certain that whatever is said in that room is understood by everyone exactly as it was meant, no more generous to one side than the words themselves allow. That is all translation is in the end. Not diplomacy, not persuasion. Just the truth, carried across a gap without losing anything on the way. Samuel looked at her for a long moment across the fire, snow settling silver in her drying hair, and thought that he had never in his life heard anyone describe a duty so plainly and meant every word of it so completely. "I'd like to help see you safe to Cedar Crossing," he said. "Not because I think you need looking after, you've made it plain enough tonight you don't, but because that road ahead is mine. I know every soft shoulder and bad ford on it, and because I would consider it an honor to finish making up for this afternoon. You may drive the Whitfield's relief team as far as Cedar Crossing, Mr. Haskins," Mabel said, with the particular dryness he was beginning to recognize as her version of affection, "on the condition that you never again tip your hat to a woman before you know her name." "I believe I can manage that," he said, "seeing as I already know yours and don't intend to forget it." They reached Cedar Crossing on the third day, the snow having eased into a hard, bright cold that lay 2 inches deep over the settlement's dozen buildings, smoke standing straight up from every chimney into a flawless blue sky, the blue mountains rising white and enormous to the east. Cedar Crossing sat where Coulter Creek widened out of its canyon into the beginnings of a broad valley, a scatter of log houses and a general store and a small whitewashed church, with the Birch Creek Canal Company's survey camp visible as a cluster of tents and freight wagons on the rise above the settlement, close by the beginning of the grade that climbed toward the timber the company meant to use for its flume construction. Agent Colton Reeves met them at the edge of town, a tired-looking man in his 50s with ink-stained fingers and the manner of someone who had not slept well in weeks. Miss Sawyer, thank the Lord you made it through. I was beginning to fear the storm had taken the road out entirely. Mr. Haskins, good to see you, though I confess I expected you 3 days past with the mail. There was a delay at Alder Junction, Samuel said, with a glance at Mabel that made her lips twitch despite herself. Won't happen again. The council is set for 4 days from now, Reeves went on, at the schoolhouse, weather permitting. Elder Wildhorse has agreed to bring representatives from the reservation lands, and the company has, agreed to send Miss Pratt and Mr. Crane to represent their interests. I will tell you plainly, Miss Sawyer, tempers are already running hot. There was an incident at the creek 2 days back. Some of Crane's men driving survey stakes on ground the Wildhorse family has fished from since before this town existed, and it very nearly came to blows before I got out there myself. Then we have 4 days to make certain the council itself does not do the same, Mabel said. I will want to speak with Elder Wildhorse before anything else, to agree on how we will handle any disputed terms. Reeves nodded, visibly relieved to have someone competent taking charge of at least one corner of the disaster he seemed to feel closing in on him. And Mabel set to work with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had traveled 200 miles specifically to do this, leaving Samuel to see to his team, and to the Whitfield families settling in on a claim a half-mile north of town. A piece of business that occupied the better part of that first day, but did nothing to loosen the new and unfamiliar thread of worry that had wound itself around his thoughts, a thread with Mabel Sawyer's name tied to the end of it. He found her that evening at the edge of the settlement, standing at the fence line above the creek, watching the water run dark and swift below the thin ice forming at its edges, her breath showing white in the cold. Elder Wildhorse says the fishing weir upstream has already gone dry twice this season, she said, without turning, when she heard his boots on the frozen ground. Twice, Mr. Haskins. In a year the company has not even finished its diversion works. If they complete that flume, there will be no salmon run worth the name within 3 years, and no water left for Amos Whitfield's cattle either, for that matter. Everyone in this valley is about to lose something to the same company, and half of them do not yet understand that they are on the same side of this fight. That's the game companies like Crane's play, Samuel said, coming to stand beside her at the fence. Convince the settlers the reservation is their enemy, and convince the reservation the settlers are theirs, so neither side notices who's actually holding the deed. Yes, Mabel said. Which is precisely why every word said in that schoolhouse in 4 days' time has to be exact. If Crane's people can make it sound as though sharing the water fairly means the ranchers get nothing, or make it sound to the Wildhorse family that the treaty terms are being generously extended rather than simply honored, they will turn this valley against itself before anyone realizes the company was the thief all along. Samuel was quiet a moment, watching the black water slide past beneath its rim of new ice. You carry a great deal on your shoulders for one woman with a satchel full of words. Words are the only weapon I have ever needed, Mr. Haskins. I have found they do quite well, provided a person is willing to use them honestly, which is rarer than you might think. I am beginning to understand why you took such offense at me thinking you might use them dishonestly. She glanced at him sideways, the corner of her mouth curving in the cold air. You are learning, Samuel Haskins. Slowly, but you are learning. I have a good teacher, he said, and was rewarded with something that was almost, though not quite, a real smile. The 4 days before the council passed in a strange suspended tension, the settlement of Cedar Crossing going about its ordinary business of woodcutting and cattle tending, and church on Sunday, while the survey camp on the rise above it hummed with its own separate, ominous industry, freight wagons coming and going loaded with iron pipe and cut lumber for the flume works. Josiah Crane riding through the settlement most afternoons on a big roan gelding with the unhurried confidence of a man who considered the outcome of the council already decided in his favor. Samuel and Mabel found reasons to be in each other's company more often than either of them strictly needed to be. he teaching her the particular whistle that called his lead horse to stand still on command. She teaching him 3 words of Sahaptin greeting that he mangled badly enough to make her laugh outright for the first time since the depot, a sound he found he wanted very much to hear again. Their conversations ran easily to argument and back to laughter within the space of a single walk to the creek and back, dry and quick between them, a rhythm neither of them had found with anyone else before, and underneath the banter something steadier was building, a trust laid down one honest exchange at a time, the way a good road is laid down one careful mile at a time rather than all at once. It was on the 3rd evening, sitting on the porch steps of the small cabin Reeves had arranged for her lodging, that Mabel finally said what she had been turning over since the fire at the ford. "I have been thinking about what you told me, about your father's ranch." Samuel, sitting a careful, proper distance away on the same step, went still. "What about it? You said the company that took his water right did it with a lawyer and a smile, no violence at all, simply paper and patience. And now here you are, watching another company do the same thing to another creek, and instead of staying well clear of it, as any sensible man who had already lost once might do, you drove 3 days through a snowstorm to see a stranger safely to the very council meant to stop it happening again. That is not the behavior of a man who has made his peace with what happened to his family, Samuel. That is the behavior of a man still fighting the same fight, just wearing a different face this time." He was quiet long enough that she thought perhaps she had overstepped, but when he spoke, his voice was low and steady in the dark. "My father died 3 years after we lost that ranch, Mabel. Not of anything anyone could point to, just of a kind of tiredness that settled into him and never lifted. I was 19 when we moved off that land the last time, and I promised myself standing in the wagon bed watching. The house gets smaller behind us that I would never again stand by and watch it happen to somebody else if I had it in my power to do otherwise. I have been driving this road for 11 years, mostly because it is good honest work and I am good at it, but partly, if I am honest with you the way you have been honest with me, because it keeps me close to every soul in this valley, and close means I notice things. I noticed Crane's survey stakes 3 weeks before the company ever announced its intentions publicly. I sent word to Reeves myself. I did not know, until I stood on that depot platform and made a great fool of myself in front of you, quite how much this particular fight had come to matter to me again." Mabel looked at him for a long moment in the lamplight spilling from the cabin window, and something in her chest, careful and guarded for so many years by necessity, loosened just slightly. "Then I am glad in the end that you tipped your hat to the wrong woman," she said, "because it seems to have brought the right man to the right creek at exactly the moment he was needed." He reached over, slow enough that she could have pulled away and did not, and took her gloved hand in his, and they sat like that a long while on the cold porch step, saying nothing further, needing nothing further said. The council convened 4 days later in the Cedar Crossing schoolhouse, benches pushed back against the walls to make room for the crowd that had gathered, ranchers and their wives on one side, a delegation from the reservation lands on the other, Elder Wildhorse seated with quiet dignity at their head, a handful of younger men beside him who watched the proceedings with wary, careful attention. Agent Reeves sat at the front behind a borrowed table, with Mabel at his right hand, and at the left sat Eugenia Pratt, a composed, handsome woman of perhaps 40 in an expensive traveling coat, and beside her Josiah Crane, broad-shouldered and impatient, his hat pushed back on his head as though he found the entire proceeding beneath him. "We are gathered," Reeves began, "to discuss the matter of water allocation along Coulter Creek, in light of the proposed diversion works of the Birch Creek Canal and Irrigation Company, and in light of the water and fishing rights reserved to the Cayuse and Umatilla people under the Treaty of 1855. Mabel translated this in a clear, carrying voice, and Elder Wildhorse nodded once, satisfied, and the council began. It went reasonably well for the better part of an hour, Eugenia Pratt presenting the company's proposal with a smooth, practiced confidence, promising shared benefit and modest allocation and prosperity for all, and Mabel rendering every sentence into Southampton with careful precision, catching and correcting twice already a slight softening of terms that Pratt's own hired man, seated behind her taking notes, had let slip into his own murmured aside, translations meant to reach only the company's side of the room. But it was Josiah Crane who broke the fragile calm, standing abruptly when Elder Wildhorse raised a question about the treaty's guarantee of usual and accustomed fishing stations, and declaring loudly that the company's engineers had already determined the flume works would proceed regardless of any council's opinion, treaty or no treaty, because the claim had been properly filed and properly bought. The room went cold and still. Several of the younger men from the reservation delegation came half up from their bench, and two ranchers near the back, men who had themselves grown uneasy over the past days about exactly how little water the company's own figures left for their cattle, muttered darkly to one another. It was into this rising danger that Crane's own hired translator, a nervous young man named Foss, who Mabel recognized at once from Reeves's earlier warning, began rendering Crane's outburst into Southampton, and in his haste or his loyalty to his employer, he softened the words considerably, translating the threat of the company proceeding regardless of the treaty into something closer to a claim that the treaty terms had already been formally satisfied, and the council was merely a courtesy. Mabel was on her feet before Foss had finished the sentence. "That is not what Mr. Crane said," she announced, her voice cutting clean across the room, first in English, then without pause in Southampton, so that both halves of the room heard the correction in the same breath. "Mr. Crane stated plainly that the company intends to proceed with construction whether or not this council reaches any agreement, and whether or not the treaty's terms regarding fishing stations are honored. Mr. Foss has translated that statement as though the treaty has already been satisfied. It has not. I will not stand in this room and allow anyone's words on either side to be changed into something gentler or something harsher than what was actually said." Elder Wildhorse rose slowly and spoke a few words in Southampton directly to Mabel, which she then rendered for the room. "Elder Wildhorse says that he has known Mabel Sawyer's father for 30 years and has never known that family to speak false in either direction, and that he trusts her word over the word of a man he has met only 3 times, each time finding him in a greater hurry than the last." A ripple of grim laughter went through the reservation side of the room, and even one or two of the ranchers cracked a reluctant smile, and the terrible tension that had been building broke, not entirely, but enough. Reeves, sweat standing on his forehead despite the cold schoolhouse, called for the council to adjourn for the day and reconvene in the morning, and Crane stormed out with Pratt following at a more measured pace, and Foss slunk out behind them without meeting anyone's eye. Samuel, who had been standing at the back of the room with the other men of Cedar Crossing, found Mabel outside a few minutes later, her hands still shaking slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline, and without a word, he simply put his arms around her, and without a word she let him, standing together in the cold outside the schoolhouse while the light faded early behind the mountains. "You stopped it," he said quietly into her hair. "You stood up in a room full of angry men on both sides and you stopped it. For today," Mabel said, her voice muffled against his shoulder, "Crane is not finished, Samuel. A man who speaks that carelessly in open council is not a man who has given up his plans. He is a man who has decided he no longer needs to hide them. I do not trust that at all." She was right to distrust it. That night, unable to sleep, Samuel walked up past the survey camp on some restless instinct he could not have named, and from the shadow of a stand of pines he heard Crane's voice, low and hard, instructing 2 of his teamsters to have the pipe wagons loaded and moving up the grade before first light, before the council could reconvene, before, in Crane's own words, That fool agent and his lady interpreter get some paper signed that ties our hands. The plan, as Samuel pieced it together from the fragments of conversation carried on the cold night air, was brutal in its simplicity. Rush the heaviest freight wagons, loaded with iron flume pipe, up the steep grade above the settlement and begin construction that very day, presenting the council the next morning with work already begun, a fact on the ground no amount of talking could undo. Samuel made his way back to Reeves's lodging before dawn and roused him and Mabel both, and by lamplight in the agent's small parlor, the three of them along with a hastily summoned elder Wildhorse worked out what could be done. Reeves would ride at first light to send an urgent wire to the district land office in Pendleton, requesting an emergency injunction on the grounds of the treaty's standing terms, but a wire could take a full day to raise any response. And the grade above Cedar Crossing, Samuel knew from 11 years of driving that road, was a narrow, dangerous cut with a drop on one side down to the very schoolhouse yard, where the council itself was meant to reconvene that morning. Those pipe wagons are heavy loaded, and Crane's men are in too much of a hurry to run them safely, Samuel said grimly. That grade has claimed careful drivers in good weather. Rushed in the dark with green teamsters who don't know the road, in this cold with ice already forming on the switchback, I would not be surprised to see one of those wagons go out of control before it ever reaches the top. Then someone must go up and stop them before that happens, Mabel said. I'll go, Samuel said. I know the grade better than any man in this valley. Then I am coming with you, Mabel said, in a tone that made clear this was not a matter for debate, because if Crane's men have already begun and there are words to be said to stop this peacefully, it will need to be said in a language they cannot pretend not to understand, and there is no one else in this settlement who can do it properly. They rode out together before the sky had fully lightened, up the frozen switchback road above Cedar Crossing, the snow crusted hard and treacherous beneath their horses' hooves. And it was there, less than a mile from the survey camp, that the world nearly ended for Samuel Haskins. It happened without warning, the sort of thing that happens in mountain country in winter with no drama at all, until it is already too late to stop. A soft crack from somewhere above the trail, and then a low grinding roar as a shelf of snow and loosened rock, weakened by days of freeze and thaw and further shaken loose, by the very blasting Crane's men had done days earlier to widen the grade for their pipe wagons, let go all at once above the narrow trail. Samuel shouted a warning and shoved his horse hard sideways, buying Mabel the half-second she needed to spur her own mount clear, but the edge of the slide caught him before he could follow, a wall of snow and broken stone taking his horse's legs out from under it, and burying man and animal both in an instant beneath a churning gray-white wave that swallowed all sound, but its own roar, and then, worse, left behind a silence more terrible than any noise. Samuel. Mabel was off her horse and scrambling across the unstable snow before the last of the slide had even finished settling, screaming his name into the sudden ringing quiet, and it was several long, agonizing minutes of digging with her bare hands, her gloves lost somewhere in the panic, before she found the dark shape of his horse's flank and beside it a boot and then a leg, and then finally uncovering his face, gray and still and terribly cold beneath a crust of snow. He was not dead. His chest rose, shallow but steady, when she pressed her ear against it, and she worked with a focus that left no room for the terror clawing at the edges of her mind, clearing the snow from around his upper body first, careful of what might be broken beneath, calling his name steadily the whole while in a voice she willed to stay calm even as her hands shook. Samuel Haskins, you will not do this to me. You chased me across 2 entire counties to apologize for tipping your hat wrong, and I did not survive that ridiculous river crossing only to lose you to a snowbank not 1 mile from where you were born to drive this road. Open your eyes. His eyelids fluttered and a rasping, half-conscious voice managed, "Bossy woman." "Alive and bossy both, evidently," Mabel said. Half a sob caught in her laugh and redoubled her efforts, freeing his left arm, which hung wrong, clearly broken above the wrist, and his legs, which by some mercy of the way his horse had fallen, were bruised but whole. His horse itself had not survived, and she made herself set that grief aside for later, because there was no time for it now. She could not carry him, and she would not leave him, and so she did the only thing left to her. She fired 3 shots from Samuel's own rifle into the brightening sky, the old signal every driver on that road knew meant trouble, and settled in beside him, wrapping him in both their coats and pressing herself against his side for whatever warmth she could offer, talking to him steadily, nonsense and sense both mixed together, keeping him from sliding back down into the dangerous dark of shock, until the sound of horses came pounding up the grade less than 20 minutes later. Elder Wildhorse himself in the lead with 3 of the younger men from the reservation delegation, having heard the rifle shots and known exactly what they meant, followed close behind by Amos Whitfield and 2 ranchers from town. They got Samuel back down to Cedar Crossing on a hastily rigged travois, his arm splinted by Elder Wildhorse's own steady hands, which had set more than one broken bone in his long life, and Mabel walked the entire way beside the travois, one hand never leaving Samuel's good hand, her own frostbitten fingers forgotten entirely, until the settlement's aging doctor scolded her into finally letting them be tended. It was past noon when Samuel woke fully in the small back room of the doctor's house, his arm bound and splinted, a fierce headache pounding behind his eyes, and Mabel Sawyer asleep sitting upright in a chair pulled close beside the bed, her bandaged hands folded in her lap, having refused, by every account he was given afterward, to leave the room at all. "You look terrible," he said, his voice a dry rasp. Her eyes flew open. "You are awake. Seems that way." "Feel like I got run over by a freight wagon, which I understand is more or less exactly what happened, minus the wagon. You very nearly died, Samuel Haskins." Her voice cracked slightly on his name, and he saw, for the first time since he had known her, tears standing bright in her steady gray eyes. "I dug you out of that snow with my own hands, and for one terrible minute I did not know if I had been fast enough." He reached for her with his good hand, and she took it and held on tightly. "You were fast enough," he said. "You were exactly fast enough. Seems the rescuing has gone and reversed itself on us, Mabel. I fished you out of a creek, and you dug me out of a mountain." "I would prefer," she said, with a wet, unsteady laugh, "if we simply agreed to stop needing rescuing from one another entirely, and instead spent our energies rescuing this valley instead." "That," Samuel said, "sounds like an excellent plan, provided you don't mind finishing the job with one arm short of a full driver." But there was no time left for gentle recovery, because Crane's pipe wagons, it turned out, had not been stopped by the slide at all, having taken a different, lower fork of the grade road that morning, while Samuel and Mabel had been climbing the upper switchback, and were even now grinding their way up toward the flume works with their heaviest loads, precisely as Crane had planned, time to arrive and begin visible construction at the exact hour the council was due to reconvene in the schoolhouse below. Reeves burst into the doctor's house with the news less than an hour later, breathless and furious, having ridden out himself to confirm it. 3 wagons, each loaded with over a ton of iron pipe, grinding up the steep grade directly above the schoolhouse yard, where the entire council, both the ranching families and the reservation delegation together, had already begun to gather for the morning session, Crane clearly intending his show of force to be witnessed by every soul whose future depended on stopping it. "The brakes on those grades are chain and block, nothing more," Samuel said, struggling up off the bed despite the doctor's protests and Mabel's restraining hand on his shoulder. "Crane's teamsters are hired hands from the rail yards. They've never driven a loaded freight wagon on a mountain grade with ice on it in their lives. If one of those brake chains lets go on the switchback above the schoolhouse—" He did not need to finish the sentence. Mabel was already moving. They reached the base of the grade within minutes, Samuel unable to ride properly with his splinted arm, but refusing absolutely to be left behind, mounted instead behind Mabel on her own horse, directing her with quiet, urgent instructions up a narrow deer track that cut more directly toward the switchback than the wagon road itself. While below them in the valley, the entire population of Cedar Crossing and the reservation delegation both stood gathered in the schoolhouse yard, utterly unaware of the ton upon ton of iron bearing down on the slope directly above their heads. They broke out onto the wagon road just above the sharpest bend in the switchback, in time to see the lead wagon's rear brake chain give way with a sound like a rifle crack, the heavy wagon lurching forward against its terrified team, the young teamster hauling uselessly on reins that could do nothing now to stop 1.5 tons of iron pipe from beginning its slow, gathering, unstoppable slide down the frozen grade toward the settlement below. "Cut the team loose," Samuel bellowed, already sliding down off the horse despite his broken arm, running toward the runaway wagon with a speed born of pure desperate instinct. "Cut them free before the wagon takes them down with it." The teamster, frozen in panic, did not move, and it was Mabel who reached the wagon first, slashing the traces free with the knife she always carried at her belt, releasing the terrified horses to scramble clear even as the wagon itself, freed of their restraining weight, began to pick up terrible speed down the icy grade. Samuel caught up to the wagon's side as it passed him, and with his one good arm hauled himself up onto the driver's box beside the now useless teamster, shoving the boy bodily off to safety onto a snowbank, and seized the remaining brake lever with his good hand, throwing every ounce of his weight against it, feeling the chain groan and hold, just barely, slowing the wagon's mad slide but not stopping it, not with the switchback's sharpest curve now less than 200 yards ahead and the schoolhouse yard full of people waiting directly below the final straight run of the grade. Mabel did not hesitate. She turned and ran, faster than she had ever run in her life, cutting straight down the steep slope through the snow rather than following the winding road, reaching the schoolhouse yard mere moments before the runaway wagon would have thundered into view, and screamed the warning in both languages at once, her voice tearing raw with the effort. "Runaway wagon, clear the road, get back from the grade." The words carrying in Sahaptin and English together across the yard in the same desperate breath, so that both halves of the gathered crowd understood in the same instant and scattered as one. Ranchers grabbing children, elder wild horses people pulling elders back from the road's edge, the entire yard emptying in a matter of seconds that would not have been possible had the warning come in only one tongue. Above them, Samuel fought the wagon around the switchback's final curve with his single good arm burning past the point of feeling, throwing his weight against the brake with everything he had left. And as the grade straightened toward the now empty schoolhouse yard, he made the only choice left to him, hauling hard on the lever to angle the wagon's front wheels toward the deep snowbank piled at the road's outer edge, and let the wagon run itself off the road entirely. Iron pipes spilling and thundering down the embankment in a chaos of noise and flying snow, the wagon itself coming to a shuddering, grinding halt, half buried in a drift 20 feet short of the schoolhouse fence, Samuel thrown clear at the last moment into the same deep snow that had, 3 hours earlier, very nearly killed him. For a long moment there was nothing but the settling echo of iron pipe and the ringing silence after violence, and then the whole yard erupted at once, people running toward the wreckage, and Mabel was there before anyone, dragging Samuel up out of the snow by his good arm, her hands going instantly and expertly over him checking for new injury, finding him bruised and battered but whole, and this time she did not bother holding back the tears at all. Simply put both arms around his neck and held on while he laughed shakily into her hair. "We appear," he said, "to have stopped needing rescuing from one another for a whole 3 hours before proving ourselves entirely wrong about that." "I am revising my earlier plan," Mabel said, muffled against his shoulder. "I believe rescuing one another may simply be a permanent condition between us, and I find, against all my better judgment, that I do not mind it in the least." Josiah Crane was arrested that same afternoon. Agent Reeves, finding more than sufficient grounds in the reckless endangerment of the entire settlement. And it took only a single wire to the district office, along with the sworn statements of 24 witnesses including Elder Wildhorse and every rancher in Cedar Crossing, for the emergency injunction against the Birch Creek Canal and Irrigation Company's construction to be granted before the week was out. Eugenia Pratt, to her credit, did not attempt to defend Crane's actions, and in the negotiations that followed, negotiations Mabel conducted with the same exacting precision that had already saved the council from disaster twice, the company's claim on Coulter Creek was reduced to a fraction of its original scope, sufficient only for a modest irrigation channel that left the creek's main flow intact for both the ranchers' cattle and the reservation's fishing stations. With the treaty's guarantee of usual and accustomed fishing rights written into the final agreement in language so precise, so carefully checked against both English and Southampton meaning by Mabel herself, that no future company lawyer would find room in it to slide a different truth through the cracks. It was not, Elder Wildhorse observed quietly to Mabel after the final papers were signed, everything that had been taken from his people over the years, not by a long measure, and he said so plainly, without bitterness, but without pretending otherwise either, because a fair counsel over one creek did not undo 3 decades of broken promises on 100 others. But it was, he said, a true thing, honestly won, and true things honestly won were worth more than they might first appear, because they proved it could still be done at all. Winter settled properly over Cedar Crossing in the weeks that followed, the valley going quiet and white and peaceful under a sky that had finally delivered the snow everyone had been dreading and none, in the end, had come to serious harm from, and Samuel Haskins, his arm healing slowly in its splint, found himself in no particular hurry to return to his stagecoach route. A fact that the stage line's owner in Alder Junction tolerated with unusual grace, once Reeves's official report of events reached him. He found Mabel one clear, cold evening down at the fence line above the creek where they had first stood together, the water running dark and quiet now under a thin skin of ice, the whole valley hushed under new snow, stars coming out hard and bright above the black shoulders of the Blue Mountains. "I have been offered a position," Mabel said, before he could speak, "with the Indian Affairs Office, a permanent one, based here in Cedar Crossing rather than traveling from council to council the way I have done these past years. Agent Reeves says he cannot imagine conducting honest business in this valley without me nearby." "That is very good news," Samuel said carefully, "unless you would rather have gone on traveling." "I find," Mabel said, turning to look at him properly, "that I have grown rather attached to this particular valley these past weeks, and to a particular stubborn, hat-tipping stagecoach driver within it, and I am not, on reflection, in any great hurry to travel far from either." Samuel reached up with his good hand and drew his battered, once-crushed hat, mended now and reshaped as best the settlement's saddler could manage, from his head, and held it against his chest in a deliberate, formal gesture that made Mabel's eyebrows rise in amused suspicion. "Miss Mabel Sawyer," he said, "I would like to tip my hat to you properly this time, knowing exactly who you are and exactly what you are worth, and I would like to ask whether you might consider letting me tip it to you every single morning for the rest of both our lives, as your husband, if you'll have a man who once made such a colossal fool of himself over a train platform and a rumor." Mabel regarded him for a long, deliberately drawn-out moment, the corner of her mouth twitching with the effort of not smiling too quickly. "That depends, Mr. Haskins, on whether you can promise me you have finally learned to ask a woman's name before you go making assumptions about her character." "I have learned considerably more than that," Samuel said. "I have learned that the right woman is worth chasing across 2 entire counties, through a stampede and a snowstorm and a creek and a rockslide and a runaway wagon, and I have learned that once a man is fortunate enough to catch her, he would be the greater fool of the two of them to ever let her go again." "Well," Mabel said, and now she did smile fully, warmly, the smile he had been slowly and deliberately earning since a cold night at a river crossing weeks before. "In that case, Samuel Haskins, I accept, on the condition that you tip your hat to me first every single morning, so that I need never again wonder whether you know exactly who I am." "Every morning," he agreed, "for as long as I have a hat left to tip, and a fair few mornings after that, once I've worn this one clean through." He kissed her then, there at the fence line above the quiet dark water, snow falling soft and silent around them both, and somewhere up the valley a dog barked at nothing, and somewhere behind them the lights of Cedar Crossing burned warm and steady against the coming winter, and neither Samuel Haskins nor Mabel Sawyer had any further doubt at all about where each of them, at long last, truly belonged. They were married that following spring, when the snow had cleared from the pass and Coulter Creek ran high and clean and fair to both sides of the valley it fed, in a ceremony held in the very schoolhouse yard, where a runaway wagon had once nearly ended everything, with Agent Reeves standing witness on one side and Elder Wildhorse offering a blessing in Sahapton on the other, Amos and Corrine Whitfield's children scattering wildflowers they had gathered from the first thaw, and Samuel Haskins, his arm long since healed and strong enough again to hold both reins and, more importantly, his wife's hand, tipped his hat to Mabel Sawyer one final time as Mabel Sawyer, and then, with the whole valley looking on and no mistake left standing between them, welcomed her properly, and forever, as Mabel Haskins instead.